The Galactic Exploration Initiative had a reputation for meticulous planning that bordered on obsessive-compulsive disorder, which, considering they were responsible for dropping fragile organic beings onto planets that actively wanted to kill them, seemed fairly reasonable. Their latest venture to Kepler 442f, a delightful little hellscape masquerading as a potentially habitable world, had taken 14 months of preparation, 6 committee meetings, and 1 heated argument about whether bringing 197 or 200 specialized tools constituted adequate precaution. The 200-tool faction won, obviously, because in space, nobody can hear you say, "I told you so," but they can absolutely put it in the mission report. Commander Vex stood at the head of the briefing room, all 4 of his arms gesturing at the holographic display with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he'd practiced this presentation in front of a mirror. He was Thoraxian, which meant he looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, given it an MBA, and taught it to worry professionally. His exoskeleton gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his compound eyes tracked every member of his team with the intensity of someone who had already written 17 contingency plans and was considering an 18th. Kepler 442f presents a unique opportunity, Vex announced, his mandibles clicking with enthusiasm that didn't quite reach his voice. Class M atmosphere, abundant mineral deposits, and only a 63% chance of spontaneous death within the first standard cycle. "How encouraging," muttered Dr. Quillith from her seat in the back. The Zenthari scientist was approximately 3 feet tall, covered in iridescent feathers that shifted through colors based on her mood, currently a sardonic purple, and possessed 17 degrees in fields ranging from xenobiology to advanced sarcasm. She had 3 eyes arranged in a triangle on her face, which meant she could roll all of them simultaneously, a skill she employed frequently. Engineer Pol 7 said nothing, primarily because he was a mechanar, a race of sentient robots who had evolved beyond the need for small talk, and had decided that was humanity's problem now. He stood 7 feet tall, composed of sleek chrome and judgmental silence, with optical sensors that glowed a perpetual, unamused blue. His internal processors were currently calculating the statistical probability of mission success, and the number was not inspiring confidence. And then there was Marcus Webb, the human. Marcus sat in his chair with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested either supreme confidence or a complete failure to understand the danger, and with humans, it was genuinely impossible to tell which. He was average height for his species, with brown hair that looked like it had given up on styling years ago, and eyes that held the peculiar glint of someone who found the universe more amusing than threatening. He wore the standard expedition jumpsuit like he'd just thrown it on after waking up, which he had. Each team member will have access to 50 specialized tools from our comprehensive equipment manifest, Vex continued, pulling up a 3-dimensional inventory that spun slowly in the air. Atmospheric analyzers, geological surveyors, matter reconfigurators, quantum shelter deployments, plasma cutters, gravitational anchors, and "What about a good stick?" Marcus asked. The briefing room fell silent. Quillith's feathers shifted to an intrigued orange. Pol 7's optical sensors flickered, which was the robotic equivalent of a slow blink of disbelief. "I'm sorry," Vex's mandibles hung slightly open. "You know, a stick, like from a tree. Good for poking things, checking depth, maybe hitting stuff if it tries to eat you." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Classic tool. Very underrated. We have plasma weaponry," Vex said slowly, as though explaining quantum mechanics to a child. "Sure, but does your plasma weaponry work when it gets wet? It's rated for submersion up to 200 meters. What about when the battery dies? It has a 48-hour charge with solar backup." But what if we have 200 tools, Marcus? I believe we've covered most contingencies. Marcus shrugged. If you say so, boss. Pol 7's internal logs noted that the human had just deployed something called casual insubordination, masked as agreement, a tactic his databases suggested was endemic to the species. The robot filed this under concerning human behaviors, subsection everything they do. The expedition launched 3 days later, which in galactic bureaucracy terms was essentially teleportation. The landing on Kepler 442f went textbook smooth, right up until they actually landed, at which point the planet decided to throw a welcome party that involved howling winds, torrential rain that fell sideways, and atmospheric pressure that made everyone's equipment scream warnings in 17 languages simultaneously. Delightful, Quillith observed, watching the external feeds as their shuttle settled onto a rocky plateau that looked like the universe's angriest parking lot. It's like the planet knew we were coming and decided to dress up. The shuttle's landing struts groaned against the wind. Outside, Kepler 442f stretched in every direction with the kind of hostile beauty that made for great documentary footage and terrible survival odds. Jagged rock formations jutted from red-brown soil, twisted vegetation clung to life with what could only be described as spite, and the sky churned with clouds that suggested the weather had commitment issues. Atmospheric composition confirmed stable, Pol 7 announced, his voice a synthesized monotone that somehow managed to convey deep resignation. Temperature 15 degrees Celsius, wind speed 42 kilometers per hour. Precipitation moderate to severely inconvenient. Recommendation: remain inside shuttle and reassess life choices. Negative, Vex said, already activating the cargo bay. We deploy according to schedule. Full equipment manifest, standard exploration protocol. We establish base camp within 2 hours. The cargo bay doors hissed open, and the team got their first real taste of Kepler 442f. The wind immediately tried to rip the doors off, the rain soaked everything it touched, and the smell of alien soil filled the shuttle with an odor that Quillith's translator generously interpreted as aggressively mineral. What followed was a masterclass in over-engineering. Vex deployed tool number 7, a gravitational anchor that burrowed into the ground and created a stable field against the wind. Then came tool 14, an atmospheric shield generator that formed a semi-permeable dome. Tool 23 analyzed soil composition. Tool 39 mapped underground water sources. Tools 52 through 68 comprised the automated shelter deployment system, which unfolded like some kind of geometrically anxious origami. Quillith activated her personal equipment array, which floated around her in a constellation of scanning devices, each one humming and beeping, and generally making it very clear that science was happening. Pol 7 extended 6 additional manipulator arms and began assembling what appeared to be either a communications array or a very aggressive jungle gym. Marcus stepped off the shuttle, looked around, bent down, picked up a rock, and examined it with the kind of focus usually reserved for ancient prophecies. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Vex called over the wind, his mandibles clicking with confusion. "Checking out this rock. We have geological analyzers for that. Tool 43 can tell you the exact molecular composition, age, and structural integrity of any mineral sample." "Yeah, but can it tell me if this rock fits nice in your hand and has good weight distribution?" Marcus hefted the rock thoughtfully. "Because this one does. This is a quality rock." Quillith's feathers shifted to an amused yellow. "The human has found a pet." "It's not a pet," Marcus protested. It's a tool. It's a rock. Vex said, his voice climbing an octave. Best kind of tool. Been working for about 2 million years, give or take. Pole 7's sensors focused on the rock, then on Marcus, then back to the rock. His processors tried to calculate the logic and returned an error. The human appears to have suffered cognitive impairment during landing, scanning for brain damage. I'm fine, Pole, just appreciating simplicity. What Marcus did next would be discussed in expedition reports, academic papers, and bar conversations across 3 spiral arms for the next decade. He started building, while Vex fussed with the atmospheric shield generator, which had decided that semi-permeable meant occasionally lets through horizontal rain just to keep things interesting. Marcus found a flat area near an outcropping of rocks. He used his new rock friend to hammer smaller rocks into the ground in a circle, creating a basic perimeter. Then he gathered larger flat stones and began stacking them in an interlocking pattern. Is he actually building something? Quillith had stopped her scanning to watch, her 3 eyes wide with fascination. Negative, Pole 7 stated. He is stacking rocks. These are different activities. Are they, though? 20 minutes later, Marcus had erected a windbreak that stood 4 feet tall and curved in a crescent shape, perfectly positioned to block the prevailing wind. He'd done it with approximately 8 rocks and what could only be described as vibes. Vex noticed during a lull in yelling at the shelter deployment system, which had gotten confused about which direction was up. Marcus, we have the quantum shelter deployment. You don't need to. What even is that? Windbreak, Marcus said, now gathering dried vegetation that somehow survived on this angry planet. Also, I'm going to need to borrow your plasma cutter for a second. Absolutely not. That's Tool 77, rated for industrial applications. Or I could use this rock to smash these branches into smaller pieces, but that'll take longer and be way louder. Vex handed over the plasma cutter with the air of someone who had lost an argument before it started. What happened over the next hour was the kind of thing that anthropologists would call species-typical behavior, and everyone else would call showing off. Marcus used the plasma cutter for about 90 seconds to trim some branches, then went back to his rock. He wove the branches into a framework using some kind of knotting technique that looked simple until you tried to replicate it. He wedged the framework into gaps between his stacked stones. He found moss-like vegetation and packed it into the spaces for insulation. The wind howled. The rain intensified. Vex's atmospheric shield flickered ominously. The quantum shelter deployment system achieved sentience just long enough to file a complaint with the manufacturer. Marcus's rock structure stood firm, and water ran off it in neat little rivulets that he'd apparently planned for. Okay, that's actually impressive, Quillith admitted, huddling under her scanning array as the rain found new and creative ways to violate the atmospheric shield. Primitive, but impressive. Primitive works when sophisticated is having an existential crisis, Marcus said. He was now digging a small trench around the structure with a flat rock that he'd apparently promoted to shovel status. Drainage. Don't want water pooling. Pole 7 approached, his optical sensors analyzing the structure from multiple angles. The human has created a functional shelter using locally sourced materials and minimal technological intervention. Estimated construction time, 53 minutes. Estimated durability, significantly higher than anticipated. Conclusion, this is deeply unsettling. Why unsettling? Marcus asked, now arranging smaller stones to create what looked like a fire pit. Because my species spent 4,000 years developing engineering principles, and you just violated most of them, while somehow achieving structural integrity. Different engineering principles. Mine are called "Does it work?" and "Will it fall on me?" The wind chose that moment to gust particularly hard, and the atmospheric shield generator made a sound that technology should not make, something between a wheeze and a cry for help. The shield flickered twice, then died with the electronic equivalent of a dying gasp. Rain immediately soaked everyone except Marcus, who had positioned himself in his rock shelter and was now looking at his drenched teammates with an expression of deeply patient amusement. "So," he said, conversationally, "anyone want to reconsider the rock?" The situation deteriorated with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for fast comedy. Vex's quantum shelter deployment system had successfully achieved consciousness and immediately opted for malicious compliance, creating a structure that was technically a shelter in the sense that it sheltered absolutely nothing useful. It had erected itself at a 15-degree angle, making the interior a geometric nightmare that defied comfortable occupation. Quillith's scanning array, bless its sophisticated circuits, had decided that precipitation was its natural enemy and had shorted out 3 of its 7 components. The remaining 4 were now arguing with each other in electromagnetic frequencies that translated roughly to "I told you we should have stayed on the ship." Pole 7 stood in the rain, which bothered him exactly 0% because he was waterproof, but his equipment was having a collective nervous breakdown. The communications array had toppled in the wind. The geological surveyor was beeping errors in a tone that suggested it was composing a resignation letter. And Marcus, that glorious pain in the expedition's collective neck, had not only built a functional shelter, but had somehow coaxed fire from some local flint analog, 2 rocks, and what Quillith's working scanner identified as sheer audacity. The fire burned merrily in his little stone pit, smoke venting through gaps he'd deliberately left in his structure. "This is fine," Vex said, standing in the rain, mandibles clicking rapidly. "This is all fine. We have 200 tools. We have training. We have protocols. You have hypothermia incoming if you don't get out of that rain." Marcus called from his shelter, where he'd hung some of the dried vegetation to create a rudimentary roof overhang. "I've got room for about 4 people if we squeeze." I refuse to acknowledge that a pile of rocks is superior to quantum-engineered shelter technology. Your quantum shelter is currently sideways and letting in more water than my drainage system is letting out. But sure, principles matter. Quillith was already moving toward Marcus's shelter, her pride having lost a decisive battle against her survival instinct. "Scoot over, human, and if you say I told you so, I will peck you." "Wouldn't dream of it," Marcus said, making room. "Pol, you good out there?" "I am unaffected by environmental conditions," the robot replied, but he moved under the rock overhang anyway, which definitely wasn't because he was tracking the possibility of lightning and had determined that standing next to wet equipment in an open field fell under statistically inadvisable. Vex stood alone in the rain for another 30 seconds, which was approximately how long his dignity lasted before his survival instinct staged a coup. He scrambled into the shelter, water dripping from every surface of his exoskeleton. "Not a word," he muttered. "I wasn't going to say anything," Marcus said, feeding another piece of vegetation to the fire. "Except maybe that this rock here makes a pretty good seat if you wedge it right." The shelter, which had been built in under an hour with materials that cost exactly nothing, held 4 beings, 1 fire, and a rapidly deflating sense of technological superiority. Outside, the storm intensified, because Kepler 442 Fifth had a flair for timing. Wind screamed across the plateau. Rain fell in sheets that looked solid. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged lines that suggested the universe was trying to sign its name aggressively. Inside the rock shelter, it was almost cozy. "I don't understand," Quillith said, her feathers now a contemplative blue as she held her small clawed hands toward the fire. "We brought quantum engineering. We brought plasma technology. We brought AI-assisted construction protocols. You brought solutions looking for problems," Marcus said, adjusting a stone that had shifted slightly. "I brought adaptability. That's just semantics. Is it? Because my semantic rock pile is keeping us dry, while your quantum semantics is having an identity crisis in the rain." Pol 7's optical sensors tracked the fire with what might have been fascination if robots did that. Inquiry: "How did you know this design would work?" "I didn't, not for sure. But humans have been building stuff like this for millennia. You try enough variations over enough generations, you figure out what works. Plus, I looked at the wind patterns, checked the angle of the rain, and thought about where water would flow. Basic observation. You did not use Tool 48's atmospheric modeling algorithm. I used my eyes and my brain, which are Tools 1 and 2 respectively, and have yet to require charging." Vex was silent, watching the fire. His mandibles had stopped their anxious clicking. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. This was supposed to be a demonstration of advanced species cooperation and technological integration. "Still is," Marcus said. "Just turned out the most advanced thing here was knowing when to keep it simple. I wrote 17 contingency plans. Did any of them include human picks up rock? No. Well, there's your problem." The night deepened, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Somewhere in the darkness, Vex's quantum shelter finally gave up and collapsed into a pile of very expensive, very wet components. The atmospheric shield generator was making a sound like a dying whale. Most of the 200 tools were either malfunctioning or deeply questioning their life choices. Inside the shelter, Quillith had curled up against a warm rock near the fire, her feathers faded to a sleepy grey. Pol 7 had entered low-power mode, his optical sensors dimmed to conserved energy. Vex sat with his back against the stone wall Marcus had built, his compound eyes half closed. Marcus fed the fire and kept watch, because old habits died hard, and someone should probably make sure nothing tried to eat them during the night. The rock he'd first picked up, his original tool, sat next to him. It had hammered stakes, cracked open something that might have been a nut, and generally proved that sometimes the simplest answer was the right one. Through the gaps in the shelter, he could see stars between the clouds, alien constellations that humanity had dreamed of reaching for thousands of years. They'd made it, they'd brought their technology, their knowledge, their 200 carefully selected tools, and when it mattered, they'd survived because someone knew how to stack rocks. The universe, Marcus reflected, had a sense of humor. Dawn on Kepler 442f came with the kind of apologetic beauty that suggested the planet felt bad about trying to kill them all night. The storm had passed, leaving the sky washed clean and impossibly blue. The sun, slightly larger and yellower than Earth's, painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Marcus was already outside when the others stirred, working on expanding the shelter. He'd found a natural spring about 30 meters away and had carved a channel with his trusty rock to direct water to a depression he'd lined with smaller stones. Instant water collection system. "Morning," he called as Quillith emerged, her feathers gradually shifting to a cheerful green as she assessed the damage, or rather, the lack of it. Marcus's shelter stood exactly as it had, maybe even more solid now that the rain had settled the stones. Everything else looked like it had lost a fight with entropy. The quantum shelter was scattered across 10 meters. The atmospheric shield generator would need to be returned to the manufacturer in a bag. Various tools lay in puddles, beeping sadly, or not beeping at all, which was somehow worse. "Well," Quillith said after a long moment, "this is humbling." "Could be worse," Marcus said, now stacking more rocks to create what looked like a cooking surface. "You could have ignored the human and spent the night in that." He gestured at the quantum shelter's remains. Vex emerged, followed by Pol 7. The commander's exoskeleton was cleaner now, the rain having washed away the dust from landing, and his compound eyes surveyed the camp with an expression that was hard to read on a mantis face, but probably translated to existential reassessment. "Report," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview had shifted slightly to the left. "Rock shelter, fully functional," Marcus said. "Water source, established. Fire, maintainable. Tool count. 1 rock, maybe 2 if we're feeling fancy. Status, alive and not eaten by anything. And our equipment. Well, the good news is that plasma cutters are waterproof. The bad news is pretty much everything else." Pol 7 ran diagnostics, his processors working through the inventory. Functional tool count, 47 out of 200. 17 require minor repairs. 43 require major repairs. 93 require replacement. Recommendation in future, bring more rocks. "That's not funny," Vex said. "I am a robot. I do not do funny. I do statistical analysis, and the statistics suggest the human's rock has a better operational success rate than our entire equipment manifest." Marcus had finished his cooking surface and was now experimenting with some local vegetation, testing it carefully against his lips before committing to actual consumption. "Not toxic, kind of nutty. Could work. You're taste testing alien plants." Quillith's feathers flashed an alarmed orange. After checking for the basic warning signs, "Yeah, someone's got to figure out what's edible, and I'm betting your food analysis suite is in the 93 tools that need replacing." "Tool 132, Vex confirmed miserably. "Crushed under the quantum shelter." "Right. So we do it the old-fashioned way. Small amounts, wait for reactions, document results. Humans have been doing this for 200,000 years. It usually works out." "Usually. Well, sometimes people die, but that's what makes it an adventure." The day progressed with a kind of surreal normalcy. Marcus continued improving the camp, each addition simple but effective. A smoking rack for preserving food, a latrine area positioned downwind, a crude sundial for timekeeping. Each construction used materials at hand, a rock here, a branch there, some vine-like growth that proved surprisingly strong. Vex, Quillith, and Pol 7 worked on salvaging their equipment, achieving mixed results. What they could repair, they did. What they couldn't, they carefully documented for the inevitable inquiry board. But something had shifted. Around mid-afternoon, Quillith approached Marcus with one of her functional scanners. "Can you show me how you knew which rocks to use for the fire pit?" "Sure. You want rocks that won't explode when heated. Generally, avoid river rocks or anything porous. Look for dense stone, usually darker, that feels solid all the way through." "And you learned this how?" "Camping as a kid, mostly. Some reading. Little bit of trial and error, though I tried to skip the error part, because exploding rocks are not fun." She examined a rock he'd rejected, scanning it with her device. "Fascinating. This one has micro-fractures that would cause structural failure under thermal stress. You identified that by touch and weight? And looking closely, see those tiny lines? That's your first clue. We have Tool 79 for geological analysis." "You had Tool 79. Now you have me teaching you how to look at rocks." Her feathers shifted through several colors before settling on a humble purple. I have 16 years of education. Why does this feel like I'm learning more? Different knowledge doesn't mean less knowledge. You probably know 100 things I couldn't figure out in a lifetime. But your species evolved on a planet with 0.7 Gs and a stable climate. Mine evolved dodging predators and ice ages. We learned different stuff. Pole 7 approached, having overheard. Query is the human capability for improvisation, a deliberate evolutionary trait. Kind of. Humans are what you'd call persistence hunters. We're not faster or stronger than most predators, but we're stubborn and creative. We kept chasing prey until they collapsed from exhaustion. We figured out how to live in environments that should kill us, and we turned basically everything into a tool. If it exists, a human has probably tried to hit something with it or eat it. Frequently both. This explains a great deal about human history, the robot observed. Yeah, we're a whole thing. By evening, the camp had transformed. Marcus's rock shelter had been expanded into a multi-chambered structure with sleeping areas, storage and communal space. A proper fire pit with a chimney effect drew smoke up and out. The water collection system now fed into a filtration setup using sand, charcoal and gravel that Marcus had layered in a hollow log. Vex called a team meeting as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that didn't exist in any of their home worlds. I need to file our first day report, the commander said, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. The oversight committee will want to know our status. Are you going to tell them a human built our entire base camp with a rock? Quillith asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. I'm going to tell them that we encountered unexpected equipment failures due to environmental conditions beyond our predictive models, and that adaptive problem-solving by a team member resulted in successful camp establishment. That's a very diplomatic way of saying we got our asses saved by someone who knows how to stack rocks, Marcus observed. I'm a commander. Diplomacy is tool number 3. What's tool number 2? Lying to superiors. But in this case, I'm telling the truth. You adapted, we survived, and now we have a functional base camp. Vex paused, his compound eyes reflecting the firelight. I brought 200 tools because I wanted to be prepared for everything. You brought adaptability because you couldn't prepare for everything. Turns out your approach has merit. Does this mean I get to say, I told you so? You never actually told us so. I was thinking it very loudly. Quillith laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from crystal. The next expedition is going to read our report and think we're making it up. Oh, they definitely will. Pole 7 agreed. I have already begun composing my supplementary documentation. Current working title: A statistical analysis of why rocks are apparently superior to quantum engineering, and why this troubles me deeply. The fire crackled. Above, stars wheeled in unfamiliar patterns. Somewhere in the darkness, local wildlife made sounds that probably weren't threatening, but definitely weren't comforting. The team sat in their rock shelter, around their rock fire pit, on their rock seats, and contemplated the sheer absurdity of existence. Can I ask something? Quillith said after a while. Sure, Marcus replied. Why did you bring your species into space? With all your rock stacking and improvisation, you could have just stayed on Earth where it was comfortable. Marcus considered this, watching the flames dance. Because humans don't do comfortable very well. We get bored. We wonder what's over the next hill, across the next ocean, past the next star. We've been doing it since we figured out how to walk upright. It's not about the destination. It's about seeing if we can get there. With rocks, if necessary. Yeah, We went to our moon with less computing power than your translator earpiece. We crossed oceans in wooden boats. We climbed mountains because they were there. It's kind of our thing. Stubborn, Vex observed. Persistent, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Is there? One's an insult, the other's a compliment. I prefer the second one. Pole 7's optical sensors flickered in what might have been their equivalent of a laugh. Revised assessment: humans are not illogical. They operate on a different logical framework that prioritizes adaptability over specialization. It is effective. It is also deeply annoying to those of us who value predictability. We keep things interesting, Marcus agreed. The night deepened. The fire burned low. Eventually Quillith and Vex retired to the sleeping chamber Marcus had built, which somehow was more comfortable than the quantum shelter had promised to be. Pole 7 stationed himself at the entrance in guard mode, his sensors sweeping the perimeter for threats. Marcus stayed by the fire, feeding it occasionally, thinking about home and how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The rock that had started everything sat next to him, just a piece of stone shaped by geological forces he couldn't begin to understand, but useful in ways that 200 specialized tools hadn't been. Tomorrow they'd continue their mission. They'd explore, document, analyze. They'd use whatever equipment still worked. They'd probably argue about methodology and protocols, and whether the proper scientific approach included phrases like "whack it with a rock and see what happens." But tonight they were alive and sheltered on an alien world, and the reason was sitting right there in his hand. Sometimes the simplest tool was the best tool. Sometimes the oldest knowledge was the most useful knowledge. And sometimes the most advanced thing you could do was remember that your ancestors survived with less, and that survival instinct didn't disappear just because you built starships. Marcus set the rock down carefully and added another piece of fuel to the fire. Above, alien stars wheeled through the sky, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings below. The universe was vast and complicated and full of wonders that required quantum engineering and plasma technology and AI assistance to navigate. But it was also full of rocks, and as it turned out, that was enough. The expedition report filed by Commander Vex 3 days later contained detailed documentation of equipment failures, atmospheric challenges, and successful camp establishment through improvised techniques. It recommended revisions to equipment selection protocols, increased emphasis on team member adaptability in training programs, and a thorough review of over-reliance on specialized tools in variable environments. Buried in the appendices, in a section that Vex initially considered omitting but ultimately included because honesty mattered, was a single line: note, human team member established functional base camp using locally sourced materials and 1 sedimentary rock. Estimated cost 0 credits. Effectiveness rating higher than 200 specialized tools combined. The Oversight Committee is encouraged to contemplate this at length. The report was filed under unexpected successes and became required reading for all future expedition teams. The rock was never catalogued in the official equipment manifest. It didn't need to be. It was exactly what it had always been: simple, effective, and infinitely more useful than anyone with 17 contingency plans had anticipated. And somewhere on Kepler 442f, in a camp built by hands that evolved to hold tools before they evolved to build starships, that rock sat by a fire pit, having fulfilled its destiny in the most human way possible, by being exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, and asking for nothing in return, except maybe a little respect for the old ways. The galaxy could keep its quantum engineering. Humanity would keep its rocks. It had worked out pretty well so far.